On the fourth ball, we're now going to do procedural mapping. So I'm going to select this one and call it procedural mapping. So I select the diffuse channel again. And instead of using a bitmap, I'm going to use a tile. If I double click on that object and open that material editor ball, right, I see a basic stack bond occurring. Since I'm dealing with a rectilinear material, I'm going to set my object to be square. Again, I'm up here. So I view my material as square. Now, me being in the child called tiles, we'll call that tiles so we don't get lost. Under the standard controls rollout, I can tell it what type of bond I want. If you have anything that's really custom, like School of Business is really custom, you'll make a JPEG image of it and load it in that way. Something simple like a running bond or a half running bond or an English Common Flemish bond or whatever it may be, we can load this right straight from the procedure. Then under advanced controls is how we're going to handle the color of the bricks, the color of the grout, how many in each direction. So we know that we map all of our materials based on a 12 foot by 12 foot by 12 foot cube. So that means 3 going vertically in every foot, and if I have 12 feet, that makes 36 bricks in the vertical direction. So I'll make 36 in the vertical. I have every 3 bricks, I have 2 feet. Right, so I would do 6 times 3, 18. So I would have 18 bricks in the other direction. So it begins to map out my bricks. So we can imagine that this cube is that 12 foot by 12 foot by 12 foot cube now. I can change the size of my grout, so my grout size should be around 0.075. You can do 0.1 if you feel it's a little too thin. I can change the color of my brick by clicking on the color box. Okay. Then I can change the color of the grout as well. Now this, you'll see that I begin to, with the number of bricks, I begin to get that variance in the brick, right? And we all know that when brick's made, right, it's a different color based on where it's fired in the kiln. You know, the darker the bricks, we're closer to the fire. The lighter the brick is farther away from the fire. So we can simulate that variance based through the color variance spinner. I'll say I wanted about 0.25, right? And I can go either higher or lower. The more you go, the more variance you'll have. The less you go, the less variance you'll have. My fade variance is going to be the brightness or contrast of those bricks. So if I go really high with them, right, I have that occurring. If I go less with it, I have less of that phenomenon occurring. So 0.05 is usually standard, works very well. If I feel like I don't like my random pattern, I can always try a different seed, and it's going to adjust that randomness accordingly. So it's really just a random number value that's telling it to pick a color. I could also do my own custom layouts, but I find this stacking layouts fairly cryptic, sometimes difficult to wrap your head around. So again, if you have anything really custom, I would do it through a JPEG image. Okay, so that's my brick. I click on my object, and I assign my brick. Now remember, 4 buttons over from the left on that bottom toolbar in the material editor will allow me to look at my brick in the viewport. Now, everything's fine for this far away. It renders quickly. But when I'm in a scene that requires me to be up close to the brick, and I render that brick up close, right, it appears very flat, right? Well, we know when we look at brick, it's not flat. You know, it has a texture. When I touch it, it's grainy, it's gritty. Unless it's polished brick, which doesn't come around very often. How I adjust that is also through a bump mapping, right? But instead of loading it, I'm going to do it twofold. I'm going to load it here, and then I'm going to load a texture onto the face of the bricks. So I'm going to click on my tiles in my diffuse channel of the parent object. I'm going to click and hold it. I don't want to enter into the command. I'm going to drag it down into my bump channel. And I'm going to copy it. I'm not going to instance it. I'm going to copy it. And then I enter in there. And then under the advanced controls, anything that's black is going to recede or come forward. Anything that's white is going to recede. So I'll set my color value on my bump tile to reverse. And I can adjust the intensity of that reverse based on whether it's more gray, more black. Bring that back. Then if I click render, you'll see how it begins to lift that brick pattern off of the surface. And now the last part of this would be to add a texture into the brick area itself. All right, so when I want to load a texture here, I can do that same procedural mapping into the texture setup. So where it says none on my bump layer, I click on none. It's going to reopen that editor, and I can set it back to a speckle. And I'm going to discard the old map. All right, so that should load in a highly speckled element. And I'm going to do my size as 0.025. I'm going to swap these color values in my stucco. So I begin to get a texture on my brick. I'm going to decrease the intensity of that. By moving most values closer to a gray value. And then if I click render, so you see how it begins to take on the appearance of a block or a brick. If I go just a little bit higher and go to 10, we render that. All right, so I have that set up. I can dolly my camera back out. Okay.